All right, so up until this point, you've learned about a couple different forms of inheritance. We've done just simple, dominant, recessive. We've learned about codominance. So today I'm going to introduce to you another inheritance pattern called multiple alleles. So let's get started with a little bit of review. So an allele, remember, is just one of the different variations of a gene. We've typically just been using two alleles. So for example, I've got some flowers down here. We've got a gene or a variation of a gene, large B, which will represent purple, right? It's producing a purple pigment. Or we have a small b, which is kind of the lack of that pigment. So if I look down here at my phenotypes, my genotypes, I can see if I've got two large b's, the flower will be purple. A large b and a small b, it'll be purple as well. And then our recessive white phenotype from our two recessive little b's, right? So we've just been working with two alleles, big B, little b. With multiple alleles, we have more than two. Okay, so that's all multiple alleles is that we're adding in a couple more options, a couple more variations of the gene. So for example, over here, I've got some rabbits. We've got some different colors of fur. You can see that full color, it's fully brown, is represented still by a large letter C, a capital C. All the way down at the bottom, I still have my lowercase c, right? That'd typically be our dominant or recessive. But now I've got some other options in the middle. So now I also have a lowercase c, and then it's got a little ch up at the top. And I've also got a lowercase c with a little h at the top. So these two are now just representing other variations, other kind of potential differences in that gene. Note that you're still only going to inherit two alleles. So my genotypes will still be two letters, right? Two copies of that gene. So even though I have more options, I've got more kind of possibilities, you're still only going to get those two copies, one from each parent, right? You're still only going to have the two. But again, multiple alleles just means there's more options. There's more variation of that gene. So let's take a look at these rabbits in a little bit closer detail. So we can see I've got my 4 different rabbit kind of fur types, and down below I have my genotypes. So I can see for a full color brown kind of rabbit, I've got a couple different genotypes. I could still have, you know, big C or big C little c, but now I also have my other alleles in there, and you can see that they also have kind of a hierarchy of which one is dominant to another. So I can look over here and say, okay, large C is dominant to everything else. Again, it's always going to win. It's always going to beat out any of these other ones. If I look at CCH, right, the chinchilla, it's kind of dominant. So it's going to be dominant to my little h here, or my little c. But again, big C is always going to be dominant. And you can see the same thing happens as I go down to the next one. It's still dominant to little c, but it's going to be considered recessive to these other two. And finally, my little c is recessive to everything. So if there's any of these other alleles, those are going to basically take over. That's going to be the phenotype we see. And the only way still to get my albino is 2 little c's, 2 of the fully recessive allele there. Let's look at a more personal example, though. So human blood types are a great example of multiple alleles. So whether you know your blood type or not, you've probably heard about it, or maybe heard about people like donating blood or who can receive what blood, things like that. So our blood types are a good example of we have more than 2 options. So let's take a look. So we've got 3 alleles here. So the potential alleles that you can inherit would be an A allele, a B allele, or an O allele. And again, alleles are just different variations. In this case, they're going to actually make different proteins on your blood cells. So the A allele will make a specific protein, and we'll call it the A protein, and we'll represent it with these kind of red triangles here. The B allele will make B protein, which will represent with these blue kind of half circles. And if you have an O allele, you don't make either protein. You don't make any sort of protein. So let's take a look at what happens when we look at some inheritance with multiple alleles. So let's say you again only have 2 alleles that you inherit. In this case, we've got 1 A allele and 1 B allele. So we think about, okay, the A allele creates A proteins on our blood cells. The B allele creates B proteins, excuse me. What sorts of proteins would we see? In this case, we would actually see both A and B. So this would be an example of another pattern of inheritance we've looked at, right? Codominance. So neither one is dominant to the other. Both of these are going to be expressed on your blood cells. You're going to have both proteins. And somebody who has both the A and the B protein, we say has type AB blood. So let's look at a different example. This time, let's say you have the A protein again, but you've also got an O allele. So you've got an A allele and O allele. We know that the A allele is going to make some A proteins. The O allele, however, remember, doesn't make any protein. So if I were to look at the blood cells of this person, I would only see the A protein, right? Because the O is not making any. So in this case, this person would be considered to have type A blood because that's what proteins are present. So hopefully you may be starting to see a pattern of how we describe different blood types. Looking at our chart on the next page here, I want you to take a moment and see if you can't guess these genotypes. So remember, our three options are that you can have A, B, or O. And based on the problems we just did, try and figure out maybe kind of how does this work. We talked about A and B have this co-dominance. It seems like O maybe is the recessive in this case. So see if you can't piece together what are going to be the genotypes for these different blood types. All right, so let's take a look. Let's see how you did. So in one of our examples on the previous slides, we did see somebody with type A and they had an A allele and an O allele. They could have also potentially inherited two A's, right? Because that would only make the A protein. So I have two potential genotypes for a person with type A blood, AA or AO. I'm going to see a similar pattern with B, okay? I could have two B's or I could have BO, which I'd want to get maybe some deodorant to take care of. But we can see O is still kind of considered the recessive, right? O is the one not making any proteins, so we don't see any of the proteins. We don't see that in the phenotype. AB, we also has an example. We saw if I have one A allele and one B allele, they're actually both going to produce both proteins, so I'll see both of them there. And that's the only way a person can have type AB blood. And finally, O, right? O is the one with no proteins being produced. So the only way to get someone with type O would be to have two O alleles, right? That there's no proteins being produced at all. So now that we have some genotypes to kind of describe these blood types, let's do a couple of practice problems. And I'm going to switch over to my .cam and do them by hand so that you can actually legibly read them. All right, so here we are. As I said before, knowing your blood type's not only important for blood transfusions, right, of who can kind of accept which type of blood, but another use is in paternity testing, because again, as we saw, there's some different kind of inheritance patterns with blood types. And so a way to confirm if a child is indeed the child of a specific set of parents, we can use blood typing to help us narrow it down a little bit. So all of our problems are going to kind of be looking at that, of figuring out, okay, is it possible for these two parents to have had this child with this blood type? So let's start up here at the top. Our first person mom has type AB blood. And if you remember, AB blood, the only genotype that we can have is just simply AB, right? So I have both the A protein and the B protein present. Dad has type O blood, and remember there's only one genotype for type O, right? O is recessive to both A and B, so I need both O and O. And they have a child which is type B blood, okay? So B could be a couple of things, right? We could potentially have B and B, or we could have B and O. So we're going to use our Punnett Square to double check and see, okay, could these parents have actually had this offspring, and maybe give us a clue as to which genotype the child would actually be. So let's jump on down to a Punnett Square here. First, I want to fill in my parents' genotypes, right? So if you remember, the mom was type AB, so at the top I'm going to put A and B. And our father was type O, so we have two O's. Okay, we're going to fill in our Punnett Square just as we always have. And we'll see, okay, I end up with AO, AO, BO, and BO. So if these two parents were to have an offspring, the potential blood types look like they would be type A, right? Because O again is kind of recessive in this case. So we could have a type A child, or we could have a type B child. Remember, O is also recessive to B. So as we look back up at our test, We can see their child does have type B blood. So this is potentially, right, an offspring of these two parents. And we can also narrow down what their genotype is. So we know that they can only have type BO or type B blood with the genotype BO. So we can kind of confirm and say, yep, that's likely the child's genotype. Okay, let's take a look at another example here. So next up, we've got a parent mom that has type O blood. Remember, we've only got one possible genotype for O, so I'll have OO. Dad also type O blood, so we know their genotypes for sure. And our heir is type A blood. Remember, there's a couple possible genotypes for type A. We could have AA, or we could have AO. Let's go on over to our Punnett Square and see if this is a possible offspring. So both our mother and father were type O, so we've got a lot of O's to fill in on our Punnett Square here. So there's mom, there's dad. And as I start to fill in my Punnett Square, I have OO, O and O, O and O, and OO. So the only possible blood type that their child could have would be to be type O blood. If I look back at our heir, it looks like this child is not biologically their child, right? There's no possible way to get a type A blood person if both of the parents are type O blood. Okay, let's get a little bit more complicated. So this one we determined can't happen, right? Not possible. Okay, next up, we're gonna make it a little bit more challenging here. So I've got mom who has type A. Remember, we've got a couple potential genotypes, so she could be AA, she could be AO. Dad has type B. We're going to see a similar scenario. He has potentially maybe a BB genotype or potentially BO. And their heir also has type A blood. So we've got a lot of potential genotypes here, right? So they could also have AA or AO. So this Punnett Square will hopefully help us maybe narrow down what the genotype of any of these are. We might in fact have to maybe do a couple of different Punnett Squares here. So let's start with making both parents with both genomes or genotypes, sorry, that are fully A, fully B. So let me move that there. So if I make my Punnett Square, I fill it out, I get AB, 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 and AB. Okay, if I look back at my child, well, type A blood isn't possible with that cross, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean anything though, right? Because we said these parents have a lot of potential genotypes. So let's maybe try another Punnett Square. I'm just gonna flip this one over to the back and draw myself a new Punnett Square. Here's my new Punnett Square. This time, let's try the combination of maybe they both have that recessive kind of O, right? So let's say mom has AO. Let me double check that she's type A. Yep, and dad has BO. Okay, I do my cross. I end up with AB, AO, BO, and OO. Okay, so we can have potentially AB blood, B blood, A blood, or O blood. We have pretty much all of the possible genotypes or all possible blood types. And that would lead us to say, okay, yep, A was a possibility, right? We had one of our Punnett Squares say AO. So our child is likely going to be an AO genotype, but this is a possible child, right? None of these are definitive, but they could potentially have a child with that blood type. All right, so that's it for this video. Remember that multiple alleles simply just means that there's more than two options for this gene, more than two variations for a gene. We took a look at blood typing today, and you should hopefully be able to go through some of those examples, those Punnett Squares. If you've got questions, obviously let us know, but thanks for watching.